"Don't expect a single dollar of this estate, you idiot. My lawyer's going to bury you in court." My father's voice slammed across the probate courtroom so hard that even the clerk behind the desk stopped typing. A few people gasped softly. Someone in the back muttered, "Jesus Christ." I didn't react. At 78 years old, Richard Carter still knew how to command a room. Thick silver hair, expensive gray suit, gold watch visible beneath his cuff. Even sitting down, he carried himself like a man who believed the world belonged to him. And for most of his life it had. 3 construction companies across coastal Georgia, commercial properties, rental homes, a marina outside Savannah. More money than anybody in our family ever thought possible back when my grandfather was fixing shrimp boats for cash. But money had changed my father. Or maybe it had simply revealed who he already was. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper coffee and furniture polish. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. Outside the tall windows, rain tapped against the glass. My younger brother Daniel sat behind my father with his arms folded, pretending not to enjoy the humiliation. My sister Linda stared down at her lap, avoiding eye contact completely. I stood alone at the petitioner's table, just the way they wanted it. My father pointed at me with a trembling finger. "She abandoned this family 20 years ago," he snapped at the judge. "Now she shows up wanting a payout? Absolutely not." The judge, an older woman named Harriet Coleman, adjusted her glasses calmly. "Mr. Carter," she said, "you will lower your voice in my courtroom." My father leaned back, furious but silent. Beside him sat his attorney, Robert Hensley. The moment I saw him earlier that morning, I recognized him instantly, despite the extra wrinkles and thinning hair. Robert still had the same sharp jawline, same careful posture, same habit of folding his hands together before speaking. For the first 15 minutes of the hearing, he hadn't looked directly at me once. That told me everything. He already knew who I was. I slowly turned toward him now. "Robert," I said quietly. His eyes finally lifted. The room suddenly felt very small. "Do you remember me?" For a second, nobody moved. Then all the color drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly. "Wait," he whispered. My father frowned. Robert stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you were Navy JAG." The courtroom went silent. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. My father looked between us confused. What the hell is he talking about? I kept my eyes on Robert. The last time we'd seen each other was nearly 16 years earlier at a military legal conference in Norfolk, Virginia. Back then, I was Commander Evelyn Carter, U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps. Robert had been a civilian consultant assisting an internal fraud investigation involving military contractors. A messy case. The kind powerful people wanted buried. I helped expose it anyway. Robert never forgot. Apparently neither had I. Judge Coleman leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hensley," she asked, "is there an issue?" Robert swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor," he said automatically. But his voice lacked confidence now. My father leaned closer to him. "You said this would be simple," he hissed under his breath. Robert didn't answer. That worried my father more than shouting ever could. I finally sat down, slowly smoothing the sleeve of my navy blue blazer. At 52, I had learned something important about conflict. The calmest person in the room usually holds the real power. My father had spent his entire life mistaking volume for strength. Judge Coleman reviewed several papers in front of her. This hearing concerns the Carter estate restructuring and the petition filed by Ms. Evelyn Carter, requesting review of recent asset transfers, she said evenly. Daniel scoffed loudly behind my father. "Asset transfers," he muttered. "Here we go." I ignored him. The truth was, I hadn't returned to Savannah for money. Not really. I came back because something smelled wrong. 3 weeks earlier, an old family friend named Margaret Lewis called me unexpectedly in Norfolk. Margaret had worked as my mother's church friend for over 30 years. She sounded nervous on the phone. "Your father's changing everything," she'd whispered. "Properties and accounts, signatures. Honey, I think somebody's taking advantage of him." At first, I almost ignored it. After 2 decades of distance, I'd built a peaceful life away from my family's chaos. I taught legal ethics seminars now. Quiet work, quiet home. Quiet mornings drinking coffee near Chesapeake Bay. Then Margaret said something that changed everything. "Your mother would have wanted you to look into this." That sentence stayed with me all night. My mother had been gone 11 years. Breast cancer. Fast and cruel. She was the only reason I ever came home after joining the Navy. And if I was being honest with myself, losing her was the moment I truly lost the rest of my family, too. Judge Coleman looked toward Robert again. "Counselor, are you prepared to proceed?" Robert blinked like he'd forgotten where he was. Yes, Your Honor. But he still couldn't look at me comfortably. My father noticed. I could see it in his face now. The confidence was slipping. Slowly. Quietly. Like sand beneath a collapsing foundation. Daniel suddenly leaned forward. This is ridiculous, he said. She disappears for 20 years and now suddenly she cares about Dad. I turned toward him calmly. You transferred 6 properties in 14 months, I said. Daniel's face tightened instantly. That's business. Into shell companies. So what? While Dad was under medical supervision. My father slammed his palm against the table. That's enough. Judge Coleman raised her voice sharply. One more outburst and I'll clear this courtroom. Silence returned. Robert rubbed his forehead. For the first time since I walked in that morning, he finally spoke directly to my father instead of around him. Richard, he said quietly, there are some things we may need to discuss privately. My father stared at him in disbelief. What things? Robert hesitated. That hesitation changed the entire room. Because powerful attorneys don't hesitate unless danger is real. My father's confidence began draining from his face the same way color had drained from Robert's earlier. I knew that look. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of losing control. Judge Coleman announced a short recess. The moment her gavel struck, conversations exploded across the courtroom. People whispered. Daniel stood abruptly. Linda still wouldn't look at me. My father grabbed Robert's arm aggressively. What's going on? He demanded. Robert glanced toward me one more time. Then he quietly said words that made my father go completely still. She's not here for the money. And suddenly, for the first time in 22 years, my father looked afraid of me. When the courtroom emptied for recess, I stepped into the hallway and stood beside one of the tall windows overlooking Reynolds Street. Rainwater slid slowly down the glass. Savannah always smelled the same after a storm. Wet pavement, salt air drifting in from the river, magnolia trees soaked dark beneath gray skies. For a moment, I forgot I was standing inside a courthouse preparing to fight my own family. Then I heard my father yelling down the hallway. She's bluffing, he snapped. That's all this is. Daniel answered in a lower voice I couldn't fully hear. Robert said nothing. That silence told me more than words ever could. I folded my hands together and looked outside. At my age, people expect anger to cool down with time. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it hardens instead. I hadn't spoken to my father for almost 4 years before Margaret called me. But the truth was our real separation started much earlier. Long before lawyers, long before courtrooms. Back when I was 18 years old and foolish enough to believe my father might someday be proud of me. In 1992, our family lived in a large white house outside Savannah near the Wilmington River. Back then, my father was still building his business. He worked constantly. Construction contracts during the day, financial meetings at night, every conversation at the dinner table eventually turned into money growth expansion or loyalty. Especially loyalty. My father valued loyalty above almost everything else. You take care of family, he used to say. Family takes care of you. What he really meant was, do what I say. My brother Daniel loved that arrangement. He worshipped my father from childhood, followed him to job sites every weekend, learned equipment names before he learned algebra. Linda stayed quiet and agreeable. But I was different. I loved books, history, debate, structure, rules. And somewhere around 16 years old, I started realizing something dangerous. I didn't want my father's life. I wanted my own. The summer after graduation, I sat at our kitchen table staring at Navy recruitment papers, while my mother washed dishes quietly beside me. You really want this? She asked softly. I do. You know your father's going to fight you. I know. My mother dried her hand slowly. She'd make a good officer, she murmured mostly to herself. I smiled. You really think so? She looked at me then with tired but gentle eyes. Evelyn, you were never meant to stay small. That conversation stayed with me my entire life, especially after she died. My father came home an hour later carrying rolled blueprints beneath his arm. He immediately noticed the paperwork. What's this? I answered carefully. I'm joining the Navy. The room went completely still. My father stared at me like I'd announced I was moving to the moon. You're what? I already spoke with a recruiter. You're not joining the military. I already signed preliminary papers. His face turned red almost instantly. For God's sake, Evelyn, why he demanded. You're smart. You could go to law school here in Georgia. You could help build this family. I don't want construction contracts. You don't even know what you want. Yes, I do. He laughed once cold and sharp. The military, he said. That's a waste of a smart woman. My mother quietly said, Richard, But he ignored her. "You know what happens in the military," he continued. "People bark orders at you for 20 years, then throw you away." I looked him directly in the eye. At least I'd earned my place. The second those words left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line. My father stepped closer. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't want everything handed to me. I built this family from nothing, and now you think you own everybody in it." My mother whispered my name nervously, but neither of us stopped. My father pointed toward the door. "If you walk out of this house chasing some fantasy, don't expect to come crawling back later." I still remember the silence after that. The old kitchen clock ticking, the hum of the refrigerator, my mother quietly crying beside the sink. I left 3 weeks later. The morning I departed for training, my father didn't come outside to say goodbye. Only my mother did. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You call me whenever you can," she whispered. "I will." "And Evelyn?" "Yeah. Don't let hard people make you hard too." I nodded back then like I understood. Truthfully, I didn't. Not yet. The Navy changed me. Not in the dramatic Hollywood way people imagine. No heroic music, no perfect victories. Mostly it changed me slowly. Early mornings, long deployments, endless discipline, responsibility. I learned how to stay calm under pressure, how to speak carefully, how to read people before they spoke. Eventually, I attended law school through the military program and entered JAG. That was where I finally found purpose. Military law isn't glamorous work. Half the time you're dealing with exhausted young service members making terrible decisions far from home. The other half you're dealing with powerful people trying to protect themselves. I became good at seeing through lies. Maybe because I grew up around them. Over the years, I handled fraud investigations, misconduct hearings, and contract abuse cases involving military suppliers. That reputation spread. By my 40s, younger officers sought my advice regularly. Meanwhile, back home, my father told people I'd abandoned the family. Margaret once admitted church members whispered about me constantly. "Richard acts like you betrayed him personally," she'd told me years earlier. Maybe I had. Or maybe I simply refused to belong to him. I came home only once for longer than a weekend. My mother's funeral. I still remember standing beside her casket while rain hammered the church roof. My father never cried publicly. Not once. But after the service, when everybody else left, I found him alone in the fellowship hall, staring at one of her photographs. For a moment he looked very old, very tired. I almost walked over. Almost. Then he spoke without turning around. "You leaving broke her heart." The words hit harder than any scream ever could. I left the next morning before sunrise. And after that, years passed, quietly, until Margaret's phone call dragged me back to Savannah once again. Back to courtrooms, back to old wounds, back to my father. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "Commander Carter." I turned from the courthouse window. Robert Hensley stood several feet away holding a paper cup of coffee. He looked uneasy, older than before. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked. I studied him carefully, then nodded once, because something in his face told me the real fight hadn't even started yet. Robert led me into a small conference room at the end of the courthouse hallway. The room smelled faintly of dust and burnt coffee. One long wooden table sat beneath harsh fluorescent lights, and a faded American flag leaned awkwardly in the corner beside a filing cabinet. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Robert closed the door carefully behind him. Then he let out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered, "this is one hell of a reunion." I stayed standing. "You look nervous." "That's because I am." He gave a tired little laugh and loosened his tie slightly. 16 years earlier, Robert Hensley had been one of the sharpest civilian attorneys I'd ever encountered. Confident, controlled, impossible to rattle. Now he looked like a man carrying something heavy. "You recognized me immediately this morning," I said. He nodded once. "The second you walked into the courtroom. And yet you still took my father's case." Robert rubbed his jaw. "I didn't know you were involved when I accepted it." I crossed my arms. "But now?" He hesitated. "That depends. On what? Whether my instincts are right." Outside the room, I could hear faint courthouse noises. Phones ringing, shoes against tile floors, somebody coughing somewhere down the hall. Real life continuing while families quietly tore themselves apart behind closed doors. Robert finally pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "You remember Norfolk?" he asked. "I remember the contractor fraud case." His expression darkened immediately. "That investigation destroyed careers." "No," I corrected calmly. "Corruption destroyed careers." He gave me a long look. "You always talked like that." "That's because I was usually right." A faint smile touched his face despite himself. There it was. Recognition. Respect. Maybe even fear. Not fear of me physically. Fear of what I represented. Truth. Robert leaned forward slightly. When I saw your father's estate records last month, he said quietly, something bothered me. I said nothing. He continued. Large property transfers, sudden LLC formations, medical authorization changes, power of attorney revisions. My stomach tightened slightly. Exactly what Margaret warned me about. How bad, I asked. Robert lowered his voice further. Bad enough that I started making copies. Now that surprised me. Why? Because your brother Daniel pushes too hard. He paused. Men who are honest usually don't panic every time paperwork gets reviewed. I looked toward the door briefly before answering. Daniel always wanted Dad's approval. Robert nodded. I noticed. There was another silence. Long. Measured. Finally, Robert said something unexpected. You know, after Norfolk, people talked about you for years. I raised an eyebrow slightly. I'm sure not kindly. Actually, he shook his head slowly. Most people respected you. That caught me off guard more than I wanted to admit. In military law, respect rarely comes directly. Usually it arrives disguised as caution. Robert looked down at his coffee cup. You walked into rooms full of powerful men and never once acted intimidated. I was intimidated constantly. Could have fooled me. I almost smiled. Almost. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a thin folder across the table toward me. I probably shouldn't do this, he said quietly. I opened it carefully. Photocopies. Property deeds. Transfer records. Bank authorizations. And one signature page that immediately made my chest tighten. My father's signature looked shaky. Unnaturally shaky. I looked up slowly. When was this signed? 6 months ago. He was hospitalized 6 months ago. Robert nodded grimly. Exactly. I turned another page. One of the waterfront rental properties had been transferred into an LLC connected to Daniel. Another commercial property showed partial ownership reassigned to a woman named Teresa Molina. I frowned. Who's Teresa Molina? Your father's in-home caregiver. That landed hard. I stared at him. You're telling me my father transferred property ownership to his caregiver. 40% stake in one holding company. That makes no sense. It gets worse. Robert slid another paper toward me. Medical scheduling records. Neurology appointments. Medication adjustments. Cognitive evaluations. I felt my heartbeat slow the way it always did before difficult legal confrontations. Cold. Focused. How bad is his condition? I asked quietly. Robert hesitated carefully this time. Some days he's perfectly sharp, he admitted. Other days? He stopped. Other days? He forgets conversations. I looked down at the documents again. My father had always terrified people with his memory. Numbers, dates, contracts, debts from 30 years earlier. The idea of him forgetting things felt almost impossible. And suddenly, beneath all my anger, I felt something else. Sadness. Robert studied me carefully. You still care about him? I answered honestly. I don't know. He nodded like that made perfect sense. At our age, emotions become less simple than younger people imagine. Love and resentment can live inside the same heart for decades. Robert leaned back in his chair. There's more. He reached into his briefcase again and removed a sealed envelope. Yellowed with age. My breath caught instantly. I recognized the handwriting before he even handed it to me. My mother's. How did you get this? Margaret Lewis. Of course. Robert explained quietly. She gave it to me last week after she learned I represented your father. My fingers trembled slightly as I took the envelope. On the front, written in faded blue ink, were 6 words. For Evelyn if things go wrong. Suddenly, the room felt too small. Too warm. My mother had died 11 years earlier. And somehow, she had seen this coming. Robert stood slowly. I haven't read it, he said respectfully. I nodded without speaking. After a moment, he moved toward the door. Then he stopped beside it. There's something else you should know, he said. I looked up. I withdrew from representing your father 10 minutes ago. That surprised me again. Why? Robert opened the door halfway before answering. Because I've spent 30 years practicing law, he said quietly. And whenever decent people start hiding paperwork, he looked directly at me. Ugly truths usually follow. Then he left. I sat alone in the conference room holding my mother's letter while rain continued tapping softly against the courthouse windows. For several minutes I simply stared at the envelope. Part of me didn't want to open it. Because once you uncover the truth inside a family, you can never put it back again. Finally, slowly, I slid my finger beneath the seal. Inside was a single folded page. My mother's handwriting looked shaky but careful. I unfolded the paper, and the very first sentence made my stomach drop. If you are reading this, Evelyn, someone in this family has betrayed your father. I read my mother's letter 3 times before I could fully process it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. Not because I was afraid, because hearing my mother's voice again, even through faded handwriting, felt like reopening a wound I had spent 11 years trying to survive. Her letter was short, very short, but every sentence carried weight. Richard trusts too easily when it comes to family, especially Daniel. Please don't let anger blind you, Evelyn. Your father has many faults, but he does love his children in the only way he knows how. And then the final line, watch the paperwork. That line stayed in my head long after I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my purse. Watch the paperwork. That was exactly what I intended to do. Court resumed briefly that afternoon, but Judge Coleman postponed the main hearing for another week after Robert officially withdrew from the case. The entire courtroom buzzed with speculation. My father looked furious, Daniel looked nervous, and nervous men make mistakes. As people filtered toward the exits, my father finally approached me directly for the first time all day. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for me to smell his cologne, the same brand he'd worn my entire life. "You think you're clever?" he asked quietly. His voice had changed. Less explosive now. More dangerous. I met his stare calmly. "No," I said, "I think something's wrong." "There's nothing wrong except you coming back here stirring up trouble. You transferred property to a caregiver." His jaw tightened instantly. "That was my decision." "Was it?" His eyes flashed with anger. Then, before he could answer, Daniel stepped between us. "She's trying to manipulate you," he snapped at my father. "That's what she does." I looked at my brother carefully. At 50 years old, Daniel still carried himself like a teenager desperate for approval. Expensive watch, expensive boots, permanent chip on his shoulder. Some people grow older without ever truly growing up. Daniel pointed toward me aggressively. "You disappear for 20 years, and suddenly you care about Dad's finances. I care whether he understands what he's signing. He understands perfectly." "Then why are you panicking?" That hit him harder than I expected. His face reddened immediately. "I'm not panicking." "Really?" "Stop talking to me like I'm stupid. Then stop behaving like a guilty man." My father slammed his cane against the courthouse floor. "That's enough." Several people turned to stare. My father lowered his voice again. "You're embarrassing this family." I almost laughed at that. After everything that had happened, he still thought appearances mattered most. I looked directly at him. "No," I said quietly. "Somebody already did that." Then I walked away. That evening, Linda invited me to dinner at my father's house. The invitation surprised me. My sister and I had barely spoken in years. Still, I accepted. Partly because I needed answers. Partly because I wanted to see the house again before everything exploded completely. The Carter house looked smaller than I remembered. Age does that to childhood places. The white paint near the porch had started peeling. Several shutters hung crooked. The giant oak tree beside the driveway still stood tall, though now its branches sagged heavily with Spanish moss. I parked beside Daniel's truck. Of course he was already there. Inside, the house smelled like roast chicken coffee and old wood polish. Memory hit me hard the second I walked through the front door. For one dangerous moment, I almost expected my mother to appear from the kitchen drying her hands on a towel. Instead, Linda greeted me awkwardly. "You came. You invited me." She nodded nervously. Linda had always hated conflict. As children, she survived our family by staying invisible. We sat around the dining room table 30 minutes later. My father at the head, Daniel beside him, Linda across from me. The tension felt thick enough to touch. Nobody spoke much at first. Silverware scraped plates. Ice clinked softly inside water glasses. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "So what exactly do you want, Evelyn?" There it was, straight to the point. I set down my fork carefully. "The truth," he scoffed. "No, you want revenge." That too, I admitted calmly. Linda looked startled by my honesty. My father stared at me coldly. "You always thought you were better than this family." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I just wanted a life that belonged to me." "You abandoned your mother." That landed like a punch. Even after all these years, he still knew exactly where to cut. I answered quietly. "I called her every week." "You left her here alone." "I left because staying here was suffocating me." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "There she goes, blaming Dad for everything." I ignored him and looked directly at my father. "Did you know Daniel transferred waterfront properties into shell companies?" The room froze instantly. Daniel slammed his hand onto the table. Jesus Christ. Linda looked between us anxiously. My father frowned. What shell companies? Daniel answered too quickly. Tax planning. I watched my father carefully then. Really watched him. The confusion in his face looked genuine. Not staged. Not manipulated. Genuine. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. He truly might not know everything happening around him. Daniel kept talking rapidly. It's standard business structuring. Ask any accountant. I looked at my father. Did you personally review every transfer document? Yes. When? What? The waterfront transfers. When did you review them? My father hesitated. Just briefly. But long enough. Daniel jumped in immediately. Dad doesn't need to answer interrogations at dinner. I leaned forward slightly. Why are you so afraid of questions? I'm sick of your attitude. And I'm sick of lies. My father suddenly gripped the edge of the table hard. His breathing changed. Sharp. Uneven. Linda stood immediately. Dad? For one frightening moment I thought he might collapse. I moved beside him instinctively. Old training. Old reflexes. Slow breaths, I said calmly. Daniel grabbed my arm angrily. Don't touch him. I pulled free instantly. He needs to sit back. Stay away from him. My father looked disoriented now. Sweat gathered near his forehead. Linda rushed for his medication while I steadied his chair carefully. It's okay, I told him quietly. Just breathe. For a moment. Just one moment. He looked at me not like an enemy, but like a tired old man. After several minutes, his breathing settled again. Nobody spoke. The room had changed. Completely. Then something happened none of us expected. From the hallway outside the dining room, we heard voices. Daniel's voice earlier that afternoon. Recorded. Muffled but clear enough. My father frowned. What is that? Linda looked confused. But I recognized the sound immediately. A phone recording. And then Daniel's recorded voice said words that turned the entire room cold. He barely remembers half the paperwork anyway. Silence. Absolute silence. Daniel went white. Slowly. My father turned toward him. And for the first time all evening, my brother looked afraid. The recording changed everything. Not loudly. Not dramatically. That's the strange thing about families falling apart. The worst moments often happen in complete silence. My father sat motionless at the dining room table, staring at Daniel like he didn't recognize him anymore. Linda looked close to tears. Daniel, meanwhile, shifted instantly into survival mode. That recording's out of context, he snapped. You don't even know what conversation that came from. I looked toward him calmly. Then explain it. I was talking about stress. Dad forgets things sometimes because he's overwhelmed. My father finally spoke. You recorded me? Daniel blinked rapidly. No, Dad, listen. You recorded private conversations in my house. It wasn't like that. The anger in my father's face slowly faded into something worse. Disappointment. At his age, disappointment carries more weight than rage ever could. Linda quietly admitted the truth a few moments later. She had recorded the conversation accidentally while trying to save voicemail instructions from Daniel about caregiving schedules. The phone had remained recording in her purse. Nobody planned to hear Daniel say those words. Sometimes truth exposes itself without permission. Dinner ended shortly afterward. My father retreated upstairs without another word. Daniel stormed outside furious. Linda sat alone at the kitchen table, staring into space while I helped clear dishes in silence. Finally, she spoke softly. I think he's been controlling everything for years. I stopped drying a plate. You knew. I suspected. That's not the same thing. Tears filled her eyes immediately. You don't understand what it's like staying here, she whispered. Every day somebody's angry. Every day somebody's manipulating somebody else. I leaned against the counter quietly. Because honestly, I did understand. More than she realized. Linda looked at me carefully. Did you ever hate us for staying? The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly. Number. Then after a pause, I hated that nobody protected Mom. Linda broke down crying after that. Not loudly. Just years of exhaustion finally leaking out all at once. And for the first time in decades, I stopped seeing my sister as part of the problem. She was surviving it too. 3 days later, the final hearing began. Savannah Probate Court was more crowded this time. Word had spread. Family estate battles involving wealthy people always attracted attention in smaller southern cities, especially when rumors of fraud entered the picture. I arrived early wearing a charcoal gray suit and carrying 2 organized binders beneath my arm. Old habits from Navy litigation days. Preparation calms nerves. My father entered 10 minutes later with a new attorney named Carl Whitmore. Whitmore looked aggressive in the way insecure lawyers often do. Loud voice, sharp movements, expensive cufflinks designed to impress people. He barely glanced at me before smirking confidently. That told me he underestimated me. A mistake many men made over the years. Daniel walked in behind them looking exhausted. He hadn't slept much. You could see it in his eyes. Good. Pressure reveals character. Judge Coleman entered promptly at 9 o'clock. Everybody stood. The room settled quickly. Whitmore opened aggressively. Your Honor, this entire petition is built on emotional grievances rather than legal evidence. I sat quietly listening. He continued for nearly 20 minutes painting me as an estranged daughter returning home for financial gain after decades away. Classic strategy. Attack motives before facts emerge. Several times he referred to my military career dismissively. As admirable as service may be, he said once it has no relevance to estate administration. I almost smiled at that, because he had no idea how much my career prepared me for exactly this situation. When he finally finished, Judge Coleman looked toward me. Ms. Carter. I stood slowly. The courtroom became very quiet. At first I began calmly. I believed this hearing concerned inheritance fairness. I opened the first binder carefully. Now I believe it concerns exploitation. Daniel shifted immediately beside my father. I continued. Over the last 14 months, 6 properties belonging to Richard Carter were transferred into holding companies connected directly or indirectly to Daniel Carter. Whitmore interrupted instantly. Standard asset management. I slid documents toward the clerk. Alongside these transfers came revised medical authorizations signed during periods of documented cognitive evaluation. That got Judge Coleman's attention. Whitmore objected again. I remained calm. Your Honor, I also submit financial records showing caregiver compensation exceeding legally documented agreements by nearly $200,000. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Daniel whispered something angrily to Whitmore. Judge Coleman reviewed several pages carefully. Then she looked toward my father. Mr. Carter, were you aware of these transactions in detail? My father opened his mouth, paused, then slowly said, I believed I was. The room shifted instantly. Not legally, emotionally. People could feel it. A powerful old man suddenly sounding uncertain. Whitmore stepped in quickly. My client trusted his son with administrative responsibilities. That does not constitute fraud. No, I agreed quietly, but forged signatures might. Daniel shot to his feet. That's bullshit. Judge Coleman slammed her gavel. Sit down immediately. I handed another document forward. Handwriting analysis. Signature comparisons. Transfer inconsistencies. Whitmore's confidence visibly weakened as he flipped through pages faster and faster. Then came the final blow. Teresa Molina, my father's caregiver. She entered nervously and took the witness stand. At first she tried protecting Daniel. You could tell. Short answers, avoiding eye contact. Then I asked one simple question. Ms. Molina, who instructed you to bring documents to Mr. Carter during medication hours? Silence. Whitmore objected again. Judge Coleman overruled him. Teresa looked down at her hands. Finally she whispered. Daniel did. The courtroom erupted into noise. Judge Coleman called repeatedly for order. Daniel stood again furious. She's lying. I turned toward him calmly. No, I said softly. You just never thought I'd come back. That line hit harder than shouting ever could. Daniel's face twisted with panic now. Real panic. Not anger anymore. Fear. Pure fear. My father stared at him in disbelief. And suddenly I saw something heartbreaking. Richard Carter, the man who dominated every room his entire life, finally realizing his own son had manipulated him. Not for weeks. For years. Judge Coleman reviewed the final evidence silently. Then I removed one last item from my binder. My mother's letter. I would like permission to read a statement written by Eleanor Carter before her death, Whitmore objected weakly. Judge Coleman allowed it. My hand stayed steady as I unfolded the paper. But my voice nearly broke anyway, because hearing my mother again after all these years still hurt. I read slowly. Richard trusts family more than he trusts himself now. Please protect him from anyone who mistakes his love for weakness. The courtroom went completely silent. My father lowered his head, and to my shock, I saw tears falling onto his hands. After the hearing ended, nobody spoke to each other right away. The courtroom emptied slowly beneath low murmurs and uncomfortable silence. Judge Coleman ordered a temporary freeze on all disputed estate transfers pending a formal investigation. Daniel's attorney requested additional time. Teresa Molina left crying. Reporters near the courthouse entrance waited hopefully for drama that never came. At our age, public scenes become exhausting. Nobody wins them. My father remained seated long after everyone else stood. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man finally seeing the full cost of his own blindness. Daniel tried approaching him once outside the courtroom. "Dad, listen to me. Not now." That was all my father said. But the coldness in his voice stunned even Daniel. For most of our lives, my brother had survived on our father's approval the way some people survive on oxygen. And now suddenly, that approval was gone. Daniel looked toward me with open hatred. "This is what you wanted." "No," I answered quietly. "This is what you created." He shook his head bitterly. "You always thought you were better than us." I almost responded. Almost defended myself. But after 52 years, I'd learned something important. People only hear truth when they're ready for it. And Daniel wasn't ready. Not yet. He walked away without another word. I watched him disappear into the rain outside the courthouse shoulders, tense hands shoved into his coat pockets, like an angry little boy pretending to be a man. Then Linda approached me carefully. "Dad wants to see you tonight." I looked at her. Alone. That evening I drove back to the family house just after sunset. The rain had finally stopped. Wet streets reflected yellow porch lights and passing headlights across quiet Savannah neighborhoods. Everything looked softer after rain, even painful places. My father sat alone on the back porch when I arrived. One lamp glowed beside him near an untouched glass of iced tea. The old wooden swing creaked gently beneath his weight. For a second, seeing him there reminded me painfully of childhood summers when he still laughed easily, before money hardened him, before pride swallowed everything. He didn't look up immediately when I stepped outside. "You still walk quietly," he said. "Military habit." I sat across from him without speaking. Crickets hummed softly in the darkness beyond the yard. Finally, he exhaled heavily. "I should have listened to your mother more." That sentence alone shocked me. My father almost never admitted mistakes. Not small ones. Certainly not life-sized ones. I stayed quiet, letting him speak at his own pace. Old men who spent decades controlling conversations don't surrender words easily. After a while, he rubbed his hands together slowly. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked. "What?" I think some part of me already knew. His voice sounded tired. Not angry anymore, just tired. I knew Daniel pushed too hard, he admitted. I knew things felt off sometimes. He swallowed hard. But admitting that would have meant admitting I was getting weak. "You're getting older," I said gently. "That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed quietly, "it isn't." He stared out toward the dark backyard. "When your mother got sick," he paused. I spent every day terrified. That caught me off guard. My father never spoke openly about fear. I thought if I controlled everything tightly enough, he continued, maybe I could stop life from falling apart. His eyes finally met mine. But life falls apart anyway. There it was. The truth beneath all his anger all these years. Fear. Not hatred. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing family. Fear of becoming unnecessary. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "For what it's worth," I said, "Mom never blamed you." His face tightened painfully. "I blamed myself enough for both of us." Silence settled again. Soft. Heavy. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked in the distance. Then my father surprised me again. "I was proud of you," he said quietly. I looked at him carefully. "What?" "The Navy." He gave a weak shake of his head. I just didn't know how to say it. 22 years. 22 years I'd waited to hear those words. And somehow now that they finally arrived, they didn't feel victorious. Just sad. My father rubbed his eyes tiredly. "When people in town talked about you," he admitted, "I always pretended not to care." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "But every time somebody mentioned Commander Carter," he paused. I listened. Emotion rose unexpectedly inside my chest. Not anger. Not revenge. Grief. Grief for all the years pride stole from both of us. "You hurt Mom," I said quietly. His eyes lowered immediately. "I know. You hurt me too." "I know that too." For a long moment, neither of us spoke again. Then he asked softly, "Why'd you really come back, Evelyn?" The honest answer surprised even me. "Because somebody had to protect you." His face crumpled slightly after that. Not dramatically. Just enough. Age strips performance away from people eventually. What remains is usually the truth. "I spent my whole life respecting strength," he murmured, "but I never respected yours properly." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I held them back. Military training never fully leaves you. My father glanced toward the dark house behind us. Tomorrow I'm changing the estate again. You don't need to explain that to me. Yes, I do. He looked directly at me. I built this family around money because I thought money kept people together. His voice weakened. Turns out it just gave us more ways to hurt each other. That sentence stayed with me because it was true. I had seen wealthy families destroy themselves over inheritance, and poor families survive beautifully with almost nothing. Money never creates character. It only exposes it. My father straightened slowly. The house on Tybee Island, he said. Your mother wanted you to have it someday. I shook my head immediately. I don't need most of this. What do you want? I thought about it honestly. Not the money, not the victory, not even revenge anymore. Finally, I answered. Mom's letters. His eyes softened. That's all. And the truth. He nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, he asked the saddest question I'd ever heard him say. Do you think it's too late for this family? I looked at the old man sitting across from me. A man who had spent decades believing control was the same thing as love. And for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly. Not as a tyrant. Not as a villain. Just as a flawed father who ran out of time before he learned how to say the right things. I answered honestly. No, I said quietly. But it's late. My father died 8 months later. Peacefully. That still surprises me when I say it out loud. For most of my life, I assumed Richard Carter would leave this world the same way he lived in it, fighting, shouting, refusing to let go of anything. Instead, he died quietly in his sleep one cold February morning while rain moved across the Georgia coast. Linda found him first. She called me at 6:30. I remember sitting beside my kitchen window in Norfolk holding the phone while dawn slowly brightened the sky outside. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Linda whispered, I think he finally got tired. And somehow, that felt true. The months after the court hearing changed all of us. Not instantly. Real healing never happens instantly. Television stories like pretending families reconcile after one emotional speech. Real life is slower. Messieurs. People backslide. Old resentments return unexpectedly. Trust rebuilds inch by inch. Daniel struggled the most. Once the financial investigation fully exposed the property manipulations, he avoided most of the family for weeks. The state never filed criminal charges because my father refused to pursue them. That decision angered me at first, until my father explained why. He's still my son, he said quietly. I didn't fully agree, but I understood. That's the difficult thing about parenthood, I suppose. Love survives even when trust doesn't. Eventually, Daniel entered counseling for gambling addiction and financial dependency issues. That revelation explained more than I expected. The debt, the desperation, the constant hunger for quick money. Pain travels through families in strange disguises sometimes. Linda began visiting me more often after the funeral. At first, our conversations stayed careful and polite, like two strangers sharing a waiting room. Then slowly, we remembered how to be sisters again. One afternoon, she admitted something painful while helping me unpack old boxes from my mother's attic storage. You know, she said softly, I used to envy you. I looked up from a stack of photo albums. Me, you left. Those two words broke my heart more than she realized. Because leaving never felt brave while I was doing it. Mostly it felt lonely. I spent years eating dinner alone in military apartments, wondering whether independence was worth the cost. But hearing Linda say that made me realize something important. Sometimes staying hurts people too. 3 months after my father's funeral, I moved temporarily into my mother's old Tybee Island house. Small place, nothing fancy. White siding, blue shutters, wraparound porch facing the marsh grass. The floorboards creaked. The plumbing complained constantly. And I loved it immediately. My mother planted hydrangeas along the front walk years earlier. Somehow they still bloomed every spring despite neglect. I spent weeks restoring the house slowly, painting walls, cleaning closets, sorting through decades of memories nobody touched after her death. There's something strangely sacred about handling objects that belonged to someone you loved deeply. Every handwritten grocery list, every recipe card, every old church bulletin folded inside drawers. Tiny proof a person existed. One rainy afternoon I found the final letter. It had slipped behind a dresser drawer in my mother's bedroom. The envelope simply said, for my girls. I sat on the bedroom floor for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows, just like the day of the courtroom hearing. Funny how life circles back sometimes. My mother's handwriting looked weaker than before. This letter had clearly been written near the end of her illness. I read slowly. Families don't collapse because of money. They collapse because people stop listening to one another. Your father spent his whole life trying to protect everybody. He just forgot that love cannot survive without gentleness. Please forgive each other where you can. Life becomes very short very quickly. By the time I reached the end, tears blurred the words completely. I cried harder than I had at her funeral. Not because of grief alone, because for the first time in decades, everything finally felt honest. No courtroom, no screaming, no pretending. Just truth, simple and painful. That evening, I carried one of the old porch chairs outside and sat watching sunset spread across the marsh. The sky turned orange and gold over the water. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles down the street. Ordinary life. Quiet life. The kind I used to think I wanted away from my family. Now I understood something differently. Peace doesn't come from escaping your past completely. It comes from finally facing it honestly. I thought about my father often after his death. Not the angry version from the courtroom. Not the towering businessman everybody feared. But the tired old man sitting on the porch, admitting he spent his life misunderstanding strength. And strangely enough, I forgave him. Not because he deserved perfection, but because none of us ever truly become the parents, children, or people we imagined we would be. We just try. And sometimes if we're lucky, we get one final chance to say what should have been said years earlier. Before time runs out, I still keep my mother's letters in the living room drawer beside my favorite chair. Some evenings I reread them while listening to rain move across the coast. And every time I remember the lesson this whole painful journey taught me, money reveals people, but forgiveness restores them. If this story touched you in some way, if it reminded you of someone you lost, someone you still need to forgive, or maybe someone you should call before it's too late, I hope you'll carry that feeling with you tonight. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about family, regret, truth, and second chances, then stay with us for the next one. Because sometimes hearing another person's story helps us heal parts of our own. The champagne glass shattered so hard against the hardwood floor that the entire ballroom-style patio went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that only happens when something deeply unexpected cracks the air wide open. A second earlier, my cousin Rick had been laughing so hard he nearly spilled barbecue sauce on his white polo shirt. "Let me guess," he snorted loudly enough for half the party to hear. "They called you Princess." I'd taken a slow sip of iced tea before answering. Hades. That was it, just one word. But the retired Navy SEAL standing near the outdoor bar dropped his champagne glass like he'd seen a ghost. The old man stared at me with pale blue eyes that suddenly looked 20 years younger and 20 years more afraid. "No," he whispered. Then he stood up straight and saluted me, right there in front of my entire family. That was the moment my cousin realized he'd made a terrible mistake. The barbecue was supposed to be simple. Just one afternoon. My Aunt Donna's 75th birthday party out near Waco, Texas. Nothing fancy, folding chairs, country music drifting from old speakers, men arguing about football beside smokers full of brisket, grandkids running around with popsicles melting down their wrists. Real American family stuff. I almost didn't come. Truthfully, I hadn't attended one of these gatherings in nearly 8 years. Families remember things, especially the embarrassing things. And in my family, I was mostly remembered as the strange one, the quiet one, the woman who disappeared into the army and never really came back. Most of them assumed I had worked some forgettable desk job pushing paperwork around military offices. I never corrected them. It was easier that way. At 53 years old, I'd learned something most people only understand after enough funerals: peace matters more than recognition. Still, Aunt Donna had called personally. "Claire," she'd said softly over the phone, "I'm getting old, sweetheart. I'd really love to see you." So I drove the 3 hours. I brought peach cobbler. And I promised myself I'd leave before sunset if Rick started drinking too much. Unfortunately, Rick started drinking before noon. My cousin had always been loud in the way insecure men usually are. He wasn't evil, just arrogant. The type who believed volume was the same thing as confidence. He sold RVs outside Dallas and treated every conversation like he was trying to win Employee of the Month. By the time I arrived, he was already working through imported beer and holding court near the grill. "Well, look who finally came back from Area 51, he barked when he saw me. A few people laughed. I smiled politely. "You still alive, Rick?" "Barely. Inflation's trying to kill me." That got another round of laughter. I hugged Aunt Donna, kissed her cheek, helped carry trays from the kitchen to the patio while everyone else sat around debating politics and gas prices. Nobody noticed. I preferred it that way. Around 4 o'clock, a black SUV rolled into the driveway. Out stepped an older man wearing a navy blazer despite the Texas heat. Tall, lean, white hair cut military short. Even before Aunt Donna introduced him, I recognized the posture. Combat veterans carry themselves differently. Doesn't matter how old they get. "This is Walter Briggs," Aunt Donna announced proudly. "He served with Harold years ago." Harold had been her late husband. Walter shook hands around the patio until his eyes landed on me. For a split second, something changed in his expression. Recognition, then confusion, then uncertainty. I looked away first. I should have known right then the day was about to go sideways. By early evening, Rick had moved from annoying to obnoxious. He'd gathered a small audience around the patio cooler and started telling stories about his high school football days like he'd almost made the NFL. I was sitting quietly near the railing, watching sunlight settle over the fields beyond Aunt Donna's property, when Rick wandered over holding a beer. So he said loudly, "You ever actually do anything dangerous in the Army?" I shrugged. "Sometimes." "What's that mean?" "It means sometimes." A few cousins chuckled. Rick grinned wider. "You shoot guns and all that?" "Occasionally." "Fight anybody?" His tone had that teasing edge men use when they think they're cornering someone. I could feel Walter Briggs watching from across the patio. I should have shut the conversation down. Instead, maybe because I was tired. Or maybe because after 20 years I was exhausted, pretending to be smaller than I was. I answered honestly. "Only hand to hand," I said calmly. Knives were optional. The entire group burst out laughing. Rick slapped the table. "Oh, come on." I smiled into my tea glass. Then came the line. "Let me guess." He laughed. "They called you princess." I looked him directly in the eye. Hades. The champagne glass shattered 1 second later. Walter Briggs had gone completely pale. Not shocked pale, haunted pale. The old seal stared at me like he was looking straight through 20 years of buried memories. "No damn way," he whispered. Rick blinked. "What?" Walter slowly approached me. "You were Task Unit 7, he said quietly. I didn't answer. "You flew Kandahar extraction routes?" Still silent. Walter's breathing changed. My family looked back and forth between us, confused. Rick forced out a laugh. "Okay, hold on, what's happening?" Walter ignored him completely. He looked at me the way soldiers look at graves. "I heard you were dead." The patio had gone still except for distant cicadas buzzing in the trees. I set my glass down carefully. "Not dead," I said softly. Walter's eyes glistened slightly. "My God," he whispered. "Hades." Then in front of my entire family. The retired Navy SEAL straightened his back and saluted me. And for the first time in my life, my cousin stopped laughing. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Walter Briggs saluted me. Not even Rick. And trust me, getting Rick Donnelly to stop talking was impressive enough to qualify as a small miracle. The Texas evening breeze moved softly through the oak trees around Aunt Donna's property while everybody stared at me like I'd suddenly grown another head. I hated attention. Always had. That surprise people felt when they discovered who I used to be. It never felt satisfying the way movies make it seem. Mostly it just made me tired. Rick finally forced out an awkward laugh. "Okay," he said, glancing around nervously. "What exactly is going on here?" Walter didn't answer immediately. The old SEAL kept staring at me with the kind of expression veterans only wear around certain names, certain memories. Finally he looked at Rick. "You got any idea who your cousin is?" Rick smirked weakly. "Apparently not." Walter nodded slowly. "No," he said. "Apparently not." Aunt Donna looked deeply confused now. "Claire," she asked carefully, "what is he talking about?" I sighed softly and leaned back in my chair. "Nothing important." Walter immediately shook his head. With respect, he said, "That's not true." I could feel every pair of eyes on me now. My younger cousins had stopped chasing their kids around the yard. Even the country music humming from the speakers suddenly seemed too loud. I hated this. For 20 years I'd worked very hard to become invisible. And invisibility is hard-earned, especially after war. Walter finally pulled out a chair and sat across from me. "You really disappeared," he murmured. "I meant to." He gave a quiet laugh through his nose. "Hell, people talked about you like a ghost story." Rick folded his arms. "Okay, somebody better start explaining." Walter glanced toward him. "You ever hear soldiers talk about call signs?" "Sure." "Well," Walter said carefully, "most call signs are jokes, nicknames, dumb stories." He pointed toward me. "Not that one." Rick looked at me, then back at Walter. "You're serious?" Walter's eyes never left mine. "Son, there were Rangers, SEALs, Marines, pilots, men who owed their lives to her." The patio fell silent again. I could almost hear people mentally replaying every assumption they'd ever made about me. The weird cousin, the quiet loner, the unmarried woman who lived alone outside Temple with her old truck and vegetable garden. Funny how people build entire stories around silence. Rick scoffed lightly, trying to recover. "Come on," he said, "you're acting like she was Rambo." Walter's expression hardened instantly. "No," he said quietly. "Rambo was fiction." That shut Rick up. Aunt Donna slowly sat beside me. "Claire, sweetheart, what did you do in the army?" I looked down at my hands for a moment. "At my age, your hands tell stories before your mouth does. Scars, burn marks, old fractures." "I flew medevac support," I said simply. Walter corrected me immediately. "You flew black zone extraction." I closed my eyes briefly. Still hated hearing those words. Most civilians have no idea what military pilots actually do in war zones. They imagine movies, flags, hero speeches. Real war is usually exhaustion mixed with terror. And helicopters, God. Helicopters are where fear becomes physical. You feel every vibration in your bones. Every sound matters. Every second matters. Walter leaned back slowly. "Kandahar," he murmured. "Fall of 2003. I said nothing. Rick frowned. "What happened in Kandahar?" Walter looked toward the darkening fields beyond the patio. "The mission went bad." His voice had changed now. Quieter. Older. "There was a SEAL recon unit trapped after an ambush outside the city. Sandstorm rolling in. Visibility collapsing. Enemy fighters everywhere. Several relatives were completely still now," Walter continued. "Command told air support to back off." He looked directly at me. "But one pilot ignored the order." I stared at my untouched tea. "That wasn't bravery," I said quietly. "It was anger." Walter shook his head. "No," he replied. "It was courage." I almost laughed at that. People who survive war often get called courageous by people who never saw how much fear was involved. Truth is, courage usually feels ugly, messy, desperate. Rick still looked unconvinced. "So what? She rescued some soldiers." Walter turned toward him slowly. "Son," he said, "those men were already considered dead." That landed differently. Even Rick felt it. Walter pointed gently toward me. "She flew into a sandstorm nobody else would touch." My throat tightened slightly. I still remembered the radio static, the screaming alarms, the taste of blood where I'd bitten through my lip. Some memories never fade. They just get quieter with age. Walter continued. "The helicopter got hit twice." Aunt Donna gasped softly. "But she still landed." Nobody spoke. Even the little kids nearby seemed to sense something heavy in the air. Rick cleared his throat. "Well, if all this is true, why haven't we ever heard about it?" That answer came easily. "Because I didn't want you to." Everyone looked at me again. I finally lifted my eyes. "You know what happens after enough war?" I asked quietly. Nobody answered. "You stop wanting attention." The breeze shifted across the patio. Somewhere down the road a dog barked. Very normal sounds. That's the strange thing about life-changing moments. The world keeps moving anyway. Walter studied me carefully. "You still blame yourself." I gave him a tired smile. "Occupational hazard." He leaned forward. "You saved 31 men. Not all of them." Walter's face darkened slightly. "No," he admitted quietly. That old ache moved through my chest again. Not sharp anymore. Just familiar. Aunt Donna reached over and gently touched my arm. "Oh, Claire." I looked away. I'd spent decades making sure nobody pitied me. Pity was dangerous. Once people start feeling sorry for veterans, they stop seeing them as human beings. They either turn you into a hero or a tragedy. Neither one feels real. Rick suddenly shifted awkwardly beside the cooler. "So, he rubbed the back of his neck. "Why'd they call you Hades?" Walter answered before I could. "Because no matter how bad the situation got," he paused, "she always went into hell to bring people home." Nobody laughed after that. Not one person. The sun had nearly disappeared now, painting the Texas sky orange and purple beyond the trees. Walter kept staring at me with unsettled eyes. Then his expression changed. Not admiration this time. Concern. Deep concern. "Claire," he said carefully, "why did you disappear after Kandahar?" My stomach tightened instantly. There it was. The question I'd spent 20 years outrunning. Around us, the party noises faded into uneasy silence, because the truth was, Kandahar wasn't the reason I vanished. It was what happened after. The air changed after Walter asked that question. Even the breeze across Aunt Donna's patio seemed to slow down. "Why did you disappear after Kandahar?" Nobody touched their food anymore. Rick lowered his beer. My younger cousins looked confused and uncomfortable, like they were suddenly realizing the strange older woman at family cookouts had lived an entire life. None of them understood. I stared out across the dark Texas fields for several long seconds before answering. Because some things follow you home, I said quietly. Walter's face tightened. He already knew, at least part of it. But my family didn't. And once certain stories are spoken out loud, you can't put them back into silence. I folded my hands together slowly. Kandahar wasn't supposed to become a rescue mission, I began. The memories came back sharper than I wanted. Funny how trauma works. You can forget birthdays, phone numbers, names. But fear stays preserved like glass. It started as a routine extraction support operation, I continued. Small recon unit, in and out before sunrise. Walter nodded once. The sandstorm hit early, he added quietly. Yeah. I could still remember the sky turning orange-black over Afghanistan. One moment visibility was manageable. The next moment it looked like the world itself was collapsing. We lost communications twice, I said. Then the recon team got ambushed moving toward the extraction point. Rick shifted in his chair. What kind of ambush? The kind where people stop coming home. That shut him up again. I leaned back slowly. The enemy already knew where they were headed. Heavy gunfire, RPGs, 2 men down immediately. Aunt Donna pressed a hand against her chest. Oh my lord. I kept going because stopping would have been worse. The command channel ordered all air units to withdraw. Walter looked down at the table. Nobody liked that part. Especially veterans. Because sometimes war isn't about bravery. Sometimes it's about watching institutions protect themselves first. The storm was getting worse, I continued. One pilot turned back. Then another. And you didn't, Walter said softly. I shook my head. No. Rick frowned. Why not? I looked directly at him. Because they were still alive. Simple as that. The room stayed quiet. Older Americans understand something younger people often don't. When you've lived long enough, the plain truths usually hit the hardest. I closed my eyes briefly. I remember hearing one of the SEALs over the radio, I said. Could barely understand him through the static. Walter's jaw tightened. He was praying, he muttered. Yeah, I swallowed carefully. He thought nobody was coming. The patio had become so silent I could hear insects humming beyond the fence line. I flew blind for most of the final approach, I said. Couldn't see terrain, couldn't see enemy movement, could barely see my own instrument panel. Rick looked genuinely unsettled now. And you still landed. Hardest landing of my life. The old memories moved through me again. Rotor vibration, dust choking the cockpit, warning alarms screaming. Then the gunfire. God, the gunfire. Bullets tore through the left side before we even touched ground, I said quietly. Aunt Donna covered her mouth. Walter looked exhausted just hearing it again. The SEAL team was already carrying wounded when I landed, I continued. One man missing part of his leg, another barely conscious. Rick whispered Jesus. I ignored the sympathy in his voice. I wasn't interested in sympathy anymore. Not after all these years. We loaded everybody we could, I said. Then another RPG hit nearby. Walter nodded grimly. That's when the fire started. Yeah. The smell returned instantly in my mind. Burning hydraulic fluid. Burned metal. Burned flesh. Some smells never leave you. Rick stared at me differently now. Not mockingly. Not confidently. Just uncertain. So how'd you get out? I almost smiled. That's the part people usually call heroic. Walter looked at me carefully. But you don't. No. I rubbed my thumb slowly across an old scar on my palm. Heroic means you had choices, I said. Most of us didn't. The truth settled heavily over the patio. I continued quietly. We lifted off overloaded and half-blind in the middle of the storm. Walter added softly, with enemy vehicles closing in. Yeah. A younger cousin near the patio door whispered, This sounds like a movie. I shook my head immediately. No, I said firmly. Movies end clean. That line stayed hanging in the warm night air. Because this part wasn't clean. Not even close. The mission report blamed mechanical failure, I said eventually. Rick frowned. But that wasn't true. No. Walter exhaled slowly through his nose. Here it came. The ugliest part. The commanding officer in charge of the operation panicked, I said quietly. He ordered everybody to retreat before the ground team was secured. Aunt Donna looked confused. But if they left, those soldiers would have died. They almost did. Walter's voice turned cold. He abandoned them. I nodded once. But after we got back, politics started. Rick blinked. Politics. I laughed softly without humor. Military careers, public image, command reputation. The bitterness in my own voice surprised me. Maybe because I spent years pretending it was gone. The officer responsible had powerful connections, I continued. And somebody needed to absorb the blame for the operation falling apart. Rick stared at me. You. Me. Nobody moved. Nobody even touched their drinks. They said I acted recklessly, I said. Said I violated withdrawal orders, said I endangered military assets. Walter slammed his palm softly against the table. You saved lives. Didn't matter. The old SEAL shook his head with visible anger. I tried fighting it. I know. But the brass buried everything. Yeah. The bitterness in Walter's eyes told me he'd carried this anger almost as long as I had. Rick spoke carefully now. So they punished you for rescuing people? I looked at him calmly. No, I said. They punished me for embarrassing somebody important. That hit him harder than the war stories. Because Americans over a certain age understand institutions, understand pride, understand cowardice wearing expensive uniforms. I leaned back slowly. After that, things collapsed fast. My throat tightened slightly. My marriage fell apart. I couldn't sleep, couldn't be around crowds. Every helicopter sound sent my heart racing. Walter lowered his eyes. I heard about the divorce. Yeah. I gave a faint shrug. He said the war got more of me than he ever had. Nobody knew how to respond to that. Because what do you say? Some losses happen slowly, quietly, like rust. Rick looked down at his beer for a long moment before finally speaking. So all these years, I finished the sentence for him. You thought I was just some weird old woman who hated family parties. His face flushed slightly. I mean, kinda. I actually smiled a little. At least you're honest. The tension loosened for one brief second. Then Walter spoke again, and the warmth vanished immediately. The officer who buried the truth, he said quietly. He's here in Texas tomorrow. My stomach dropped. I already knew the name before he said it. Daniel Mercer, Walter muttered darkly. Retired general now. I stared at him. Walter's expression hardened. He's the guest speaker at the Veterans Fundraiser in Austin tomorrow night. The old memories turned cold inside my chest. Because after 20 years, the man who destroyed my life was suddenly 1 hour down the highway. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was afraid of seeing Daniel Mercer again. At my age, fear changes shape. When you're young, you fear bullets and failure and embarrassment. When you're older, you fear memories. I spent most of the night sitting on the back porch of my small house outside Temple, Texas, listening to crickets and staring into darkness while old sounds returned. Rotor blades, radio static, men screaming coordinates through gunfire. By morning, my chest already felt tired. At around 10, Walter Briggs called. You going tonight, he asked. No. You should. I spent 20 years avoiding men like Mercer. Walter was quiet for a second. Claire, he said carefully, sometimes avoiding pain also means avoiding closure. I hated when old veterans got philosophical before noon. I'm not looking for closure. What are you looking for? That question lingered longer than I expected. Finally, I answered honestly. Peace. Walter sighed softly. Then maybe it's time. By 6:30 that evening, I was standing outside the Austin Veterans Memorial Center wondering why I'd ignored my own instincts. The parking lot was full. Luxury SUVs, pickup trucks, American flags mounted near the entrance. Inside, donors and retired officers mingled beneath warm chandelier lighting, while waiters carried trays of wine and shrimp cocktails. The room smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood, the kind of place where people honored sacrifice comfortably. Walter met me near the entrance. You came, still deciding if that was smart. He gave me a faint smile. You look nervous. I'm considering assaulting an elderly general. That actually made him laugh. For a moment I almost relaxed. Then I saw Daniel Mercer, and suddenly it felt like Afghanistan had reached through 20 years to grab me by the throat. Mercer stood near the ballroom stage surrounded by donors and local politicians. Tall, silver-haired, perfect posture, the kind of man America trusted instantly. He wore confidence like another military decoration. People shook his hand constantly. Veterans thanked him for his service. A younger reporter hovered nearby with a camera crew. Walter noticed my expression. You okay? No. Mercer turned slightly while laughing at something someone said. Then he saw me. His smile disappeared immediately. Not confusion. Recognition. Instant recognition. And underneath it, fear. Tiny, fast, but real. The general excused himself from the group and slowly walked toward us. Walter straightened beside me automatically. Old instincts. Mercer stopped a few feet away. Claire Donovan, he said calmly. His voice sounded exactly the same. That bothered me more than it should have. General Mercer. The title tasted bitter. His eyes scanned me carefully. You look well. That makes one of us. Walter coughed softly to hide a laugh. Mercer ignored him. I heard you left Texas years ago. I heard you rewrote history. That landed harder. The air between us tightened immediately. Mercer's polished smile returned, but thinner now. Still angry, I see. I stared directly into his eyes. Still lying, I see. Walter shifted slightly beside me. People nearby had begun noticing the tension. Mercer lowered his voice. "This isn't the place." "No," I replied softly. "You made sure of that 20 years ago." The ballroom lights dimmed shortly afterward as guests moved toward their tables. Walter and I sat near the back. I would have left already if pride hadn't kept me planted in that chair. That's the ugly truth nobody admits. Sometimes revenge begins simply because you're tired of swallowing humiliation. An announcer stepped onto the stage. Tonight, he said warmly, "We honor leadership, courage, and lifelong service." Mercer received a standing ovation before he even touched the microphone. I stayed seated. Walter did too. Mercer began speaking smoothly about patriotism and sacrifice. The crowd loved him. Of course they did. Men like Mercer always knew exactly what America wanted to hear, especially older Americans. Duty, honor, country. He spoke beautifully. That was part of the problem. Then his eyes found me again near the back table, and everything changed. "There are," Mercer said into the microphone, "unfortunately some people who never fully adjust after war." Walter stiffened beside me. I already knew where this was going. Mercer continued calmly. "Trauma affects judgment, memory, emotional stability." Several people glanced toward our table now. Coward. The old anger inside me stirred awake for the first time in years. Mercer folded his hands behind his back like a statesman. Leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions under pressure. Not everyone understands those realities. Walter muttered, "Son of a bitch." Mercer was doing it again. Same as before. Using polished language to bury truth. The crowd listened respectfully. Most had no idea they were watching a man defend cowardice in real time. Then Mercer smiled faintly. And sadly he added, "Some former personnel build myths around themselves afterward." Walter slammed his hand against the table hard enough to rattle silverware. That turned heads immediately. Mercer looked directly at him, and Walter Briggs stood up. I was there. The room went completely still. Walter's old voice carried farther than I expected. Mercer's expression darkened instantly. "Walter," he warned quietly. "No," Walter snapped. "You've talked long enough." Guests shifted uncomfortably. Nobody moved. Walter pointed toward me. "That woman flew into a goddamn firestorm while you ran." The ballroom exploded into whispers. Mercer's face turned pale. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said sharply. But now another voice spoke up. "I do." A man near the front slowly rose from a wheelchair. Older Marine, gray beard, missing left leg. He looked toward me with wet eyes. "She saved my life." Silence swallowed the room again. Then another veteran stood. Then another. A medic. A former ranger. An elderly father holding a folded military cap. One by one they spoke. "She brought my son home. She carried wounded men herself. We were told nobody was coming." Mercer's confident posture finally cracked. I sat frozen while 20 years of buried truth rose into the room like smoke. Walter stepped closer to the stage. "The Kandahar files were partially declassified last year," he said loudly. "People can read them now." Mercer's jaw tightened. Walter's voice shook with fury. "You abandoned your men." Nobody applauded now. Nobody smiled. The ballroom had become a courtroom. And for the first time in 2 decades, Daniel Mercer looked small. Then the Marine in the wheelchair slowly raised a trembling hand to his forehead and saluted me. The entire room watched in silence. Some with shock, some with shame, some with tears. And suddenly I realized something strange. After 20 years, I no longer wanted revenge. I just wanted the truth to stop hiding. The ballroom never fully recovered after that, even after the applause died away, even after people slowly returned to their seats. The mood had changed too much. Truth does that sometimes, especially old truth. It settles into a room like smoke and makes everybody breathe differently. Daniel Mercer tried finishing his speech, but the confidence was gone now. People still listened politely because Americans over 60 were raised to respect uniforms and ceremony, but you could feel the shift. Once doubt enters a room, reputation starts leaking quietly through the cracks. Mercer wrapped up 10 minutes later to scattered applause. Nothing like the standing ovation from earlier. Walter leaned toward me. "You okay?" I watched Mercer step away from the podium while avoiding eye contact with half the ballroom. I don't know yet, and that was the truth. I'd spent 20 years imagining what justice would feel like. Turns out, it mostly felt exhausting. The fundraiser ended shortly afterward. Clusters of veterans and donors gathered around the lobby speaking in hushed voices. Several older men approached me carefully. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just quietly. That's how older veterans usually handle respect. One retired ranger shook my hand and said, "Thank you for bringing our boys home." Another man in a Vietnam veteran cap hugged me without saying a word. A woman in her 70s pressed a folded photograph into my hand. My son talked about you before he died, she whispered. I looked down at the picture. Young Marine, big smile, desert camouflage. My chest tightened immediately. Oh, I whispered softly, I remember him. And I did. That was the burden nobody explains about surviving war. You carry faces forever. The woman squeezed my hand gently. He said you stayed calm when everybody else panicked. I almost laughed at that. I'd never felt calm once in my entire military career. But soldiers often mistake quiet fear for courage. Walter and I eventually stepped outside into the warm Austin night air. The fundraiser noise faded behind us while traffic moved steadily along the nearby highway. Texas nights always smell faintly like dust and gasoline in summer. Walter lit a cigarette despite probably being told not to by 6 different doctors. You know this is gonna spread fast, he said. I figured. The veteran community never forgets names. I leaned against the concrete railing outside the building. You know what's funny? What? I spent 20 years trying to disappear. Walter gave a tired smile. And one barbecue ruined it. That actually made me laugh for real. The first real laugh in a long time. Then Walter grew serious again. You deserved better, Claire. I stared out toward the parking lot lights. Maybe once years ago hearing that would have mattered more. But age changes your relationship with fairness. At some point you realize life rarely balances the books cleanly. You know what I regret most? I asked quietly. Walter shook his head. I let bitterness isolate me. The old SEAL didn't answer immediately, because he understood. Veterans are very good at isolation. We build entire lives around avoiding pain. And after enough years, loneliness starts feeling normal. By the next morning, the story had already started moving through military circles online. Walter wasn't kidding. Calls came all day. Old pilots, former medics, retired officers. People I hadn't spoken to in decades somehow found my number within hours. One man cried on the phone before saying a single word. Another simply said, "Thought you should know." We never believed the official story. That one hit harder than I expected. Because deep down I think part of me always believed I'd truly been abandoned by everybody. Turns out silence and betrayal aren't always the same thing. Around noon, Rick showed up at my house unexpectedly. I saw his truck pull into the driveway while I was watering tomato plants. He climbed out awkwardly, holding a paper bag from a local bakery. That alone told me he was nervous. Rick normally apologized with jokes, not pastries. I set the hose down. What's in the bag? Peach turnovers. I nodded slowly. That's serious, huh? He rubbed the back of his neck. Can I come in? We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee while the ceiling fan hummed overhead. Rick looked uncomfortable in the way middle-aged men do when they realize they've behaved badly. Finally he sighed. I owe you an apology. You do? He nodded. I was an ass. Also true. That earned a weak smile. Then his face turned serious again. I really thought you were exaggerating at the barbecue. I know. No, he said quietly. I thought you were lonely. That surprised me. Rick stared down into his coffee. You always stayed away from people, he admitted. I figured maybe you wanted attention. I leaned back slowly. That's fair. No, he said immediately. It isn't. The sincerity in his voice softened something inside me. Rick looked around my small kitchen. You've been carrying all this alone. I gave a small shrug. For a while. He shook his head slowly. That general... He paused. How does somebody live with doing that to another person? I thought about Daniel Mercer standing on that stage pretending to be honorable. Then I answered honestly. Probably the same way the rest of us survive hard things. Rick frowned. How? By lying to ourselves carefully. 3 days later, Mercer called me personally. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity won. His voice sounded older now. Not physically older. Spiritually older? Claire, he said quietly, could we meet? Every instinct told me no. But another part of me, the tired part, wanted the story finished properly. So we met at a small diner outside Georgetown. Nothing dramatic. Just coffee and silence. Mercer looked terrible. The polished confidence was gone. Without the podium and medals, he suddenly seemed like what he truly was, an aging man carrying decades of shame. He stared at his untouched coffee for a long time before speaking. I was afraid he admitted. I said nothing. The storm hit, communications collapsed, and I panicked. There it was. Not strategy, not politics. Cowardice. Simple human cowardice. His eyes looked wet now. I kept telling myself withdrawing was tactical. He swallowed hard. But the truth is, I was terrified. I watched him carefully. This was the man I'd hated for 20 years, and suddenly he just looked tired. Broken even. Mercer rubbed his trembling hands together. You want to know something awful? I stayed silent. I hated you, he whispered. Because every time someone mentioned your name, I remembered exactly who I really was. The diner grew quiet around us. Older couples drank coffee nearby. Country music played softly overhead. Ordinary American life continuing around two damaged people. Mercer finally looked up at me. "After everything I did," he asked hoarsely, "why didn't you destroy me years ago?" I stared at him for a very long time before answering. Because the truth was, I'd spent 20 years asking myself the exact same question. Daniel Mercer sat across from me in that little diner looking like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Outside the windows, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway while pickup trucks rolled past in steady Texas traffic. Inside, a waitress refilled coffee cups and called everybody honey. Ordinary life. That's the strange thing about heavy moments. The world never pauses for them. Mercer waited for my answer. "Why didn't you destroy me years ago?" I looked down at my coffee for a long moment before speaking. "Because hatred gets heavy," I said quietly. He blinked slowly. "You carry it long enough. Eventually it carries you." The old general lowered his eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, Daniel Mercer looked completely honest. Not polished, not commanding. Just tired. I told myself I was protecting careers, he admitted softly. Protecting the military. Protecting morale. I nodded once. "That's how people survive guilt. They rename it." Mercer swallowed hard. "I ruined your life." For years, hearing those words was all I thought I wanted. Some admission, some apology, some recognition. But sitting there across from him, I realized something important. Pain doesn't disappear just because somebody finally admits they caused it. It still happened. The lost years still existed. The nightmares still existed. The divorce papers, the panic attacks, the isolation, none of that magically vanished. But strangely, the anger had already started fading before this conversation even began. Mercer rubbed his hands together slowly. "I don't expect forgiveness." "That's good," I replied calmly, "because forgiveness isn't a transaction." He nodded faintly. Then we sat quietly for a while, listening to dishes clatter behind the counter. Two old people carrying different kinds of regret. A week later, Walter invited me to a veterans support gathering in Killeen. Small room, nothing fancy. Just folding chairs, coffee, and older veterans trying to help younger ones stay afloat after service. Normally, I would have refused. For years, I avoided veteran events whenever possible. Too many ghosts in one room? But this time felt different. Maybe because something inside me had finally loosened. Maybe because after spending decades hiding from my past, I was getting tired of running from it. Walter introduced me simply. "This is Claire." No dramatic speech, no medals, no war stories. Just Claire. And honestly, I appreciated that more than he probably realized. The group included young soldiers recently back from overseas, a few older Vietnam vets, one Marine missing 2 fingers, another man who barely spoke the entire evening. I recognized that silence immediately. Trauma has a sound, and sometimes the sound is nothing at all. Walter eventually asked if I'd share something. At first I didn't want to. Then I noticed one younger veteran sitting near the wall staring down at the floor exactly the way I used to after Afghanistan. That look changed my mind, so I stood slowly and spoke. "You know," I began quietly, "people hear military stories and think the hardest part is combat." Several veterans nodded slightly. "But for a lot of us," I continued, "the hardest part comes afterward." The room stayed completely still. I spoke slowly, carefully, not like a speech, more like a confession. You come home and everybody expects you to return to normal immediately. A few bitter laughs moved through the room. "But war changes the speed of your thinking," I said. "Changes how you sleep, changes how safe the world feels." The younger veteran near the wall finally looked up at me. For years I admitted I thought isolation was strength. Walter watched quietly from the back. "I thought shutting people out protected me." I smiled faintly. "But loneliness is sneaky. It starts feeling comfortable after a while." Several older veterans nodded hard at that one. Because they knew. God, they knew. One man finally raised his hand. Gray-haired Army veteran, probably early 70s. "Can I ask something?" "Sure." He hesitated. "Why'd they call you Hades?" A few people in the room shifted curiously. I looked down at my hands before answering. For years, people assumed the call sign meant something dark, dangerous, violent. But the truth was never what they expected. The first team that gave me the name, I said softly, used it after a rescue mission went bad. The room stayed silent. I smiled gently. One of the SEALs said, I paused briefly, "No matter how deep into hell we got, she always came back for us." Nobody spoke afterward. Not immediately. Because older Americans understand something younger audiences sometimes miss. The most meaningful moments usually arrive quietly. No music, no explosions. Just truth landing softly inside a room. After the meeting ended, several younger veterans stayed behind, talking longer than they probably intended. One thanked me for speaking honestly about isolation. Another admitted he hadn't talked to his own daughter in 8 months. That one hurt to hear. Before leaving, the quiet young veteran from earlier finally approached me near the coffee table. He looked nervous. "You really think people can come back from that stuff?" he asked. "From what?" He shrugged helplessly. "The darkness." I studied him carefully. Then I answered the only honest way I knew how. "Not completely," I said, "but enough to live again." His eyes watered slightly. He nodded once. And somehow, that moment mattered more to me than every medal I'd ever received. That evening I drove home alone beneath a deep orange Texas sunset. Windows down, warm air rolling through the truck. For the first time in years, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I thought about Aunt Donna, Walter, Rick, even Daniel Mercer. Life had wounded all of us differently. Some people responded with arrogance, some with guilt, some with isolation. But underneath it all, most people were simply trying to survive themselves. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck a little longer, watching evening light settle across the fields. And I realized something. People thought Hades meant death, fear, violence. But they were wrong. It meant bringing people back from hell, including yourself. And maybe that's true for more people than we realize. Maybe some of us spend years carrying pain silently because we think nobody else would understand. Maybe pride keeps families apart longer than it should. Maybe forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, but finally refusing to let bitterness become your final identity. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone you lost, someone you forgave, or even a part of yourself you're still trying to heal, then I hope you'll carry that feeling forward. Share it with somebody who might need it. And remember, sometimes the strongest people aren't the loudest ones in the room. Sometimes they're simply the ones who survived and chose kindness anyway. Hope you enjoy being homeless, because I made sure you get nothing. My father said it loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others smiled. One man near the back actually chuckled. The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Heavy, ugly, impossible to ignore. I stared at my father across the courtroom. William Morgan, 68 years old, owner of a successful construction company in Columbus, Ohio. A respected businessman. A church donor. A man people described as honorable. A man who had spent most of my life treating me like I was a mistake. And at that moment he looked proud. Not angry, not emotional. Proud. As though humiliating his own daughter in public was some kind of achievement. Then I laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not a bitter laugh. A genuine laugh. The kind that escaped before I could stop it. My father's smile vanished. "What's so funny?" he snapped. Before I could answer, the judge looked up from the documents in front of him. His eyes settled on me. For a moment he looked confused, then curious, then strangely familiar. "Wait," he said. The entire courtroom became silent. He leaned forward. "You're the girl who..." And suddenly every person in that room was staring at me. But to explain what happened next, I need to tell you how I got there. Because that courtroom battle didn't begin that morning. It started more than 20 years earlier. Back when I was a little girl trying desperately to earn my father's love. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 34 years old. And for most of my life I believed there was something wrong with me. I grew up in a modest neighborhood outside Columbus. My father built houses. My mother stayed home. My older brother Michael was 6 years ahead of me. From the outside we looked like the perfect American family. Inside the house things felt different. Michael was my father's pride. I was simply there. I noticed it before I was 10 years old. If Michael got a B on a test, Dad celebrated. If I got straight A's, Dad nodded and changed the subject. If Michael scored a touchdown, Dad invited the whole family out for dinner. If I won an academic award, he usually forgot to attend the ceremony. At first I thought I just needed to try harder. Children always assume they can earn love. So I tried. God knows I tried. I worked harder in school. Helped around the house. Avoided trouble. Made honor roll every year. Nothing changed. One evening when I was about 13, I finally asked my mother, "Dad doesn't like me much, does he?" She looked heartbroken. For a second I thought she might tell me the truth. Instead, she smiled weakly. "Of course he loves you." I remember staring at my plate. "That's not what I asked." She never answered. That silence followed me for years. Michael didn't help. As we got older, he became increasingly like our father. Confident. Entitled. Certain the world revolved around him. Dad gave him opportunities I never received. A summer job at the company. A company truck. Business mentoring. Networking introductions. When Michael graduated college, Dad handed him a management position. No interview. No competition. Just handed it over. I worked my way through nursing school with scholarships and part-time jobs. Dad barely noticed. Then September 11th happened. Like millions of Americans, I watched the towers fall. Something changed inside me. I wanted my life to matter. I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. A year later, I joined the Army. The conversation with my father remains one of the clearest memories of my life. We sat at the kitchen table. I was 20 years old, nervous but excited. "Dad, I enlisted." He stared at me. "What?" "The Army." For several seconds he said nothing. Then he laughed. Not because he thought I was joking, because he thought I was stupid. "The Army." I nodded. "I want to serve." His face hardened. "You want to throw your life away." "I don't see it that way." "Of course you don't." That was the beginning of our longest argument. He told me I was making a mistake. I told him I had made my decision. He accused me of abandoning the family. I reminded him Michael already had the company. Eventually he stood up. "You'll regret this." I never forgot those words. Because I never did regret it. Not once. Military life wasn't easy. There were deployments, long nights, dangerous situations, friends who didn't come home. But for the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. Nobody cared whose daughter I was. Nobody cared who my father favored. The Army measured performance, character, discipline, trust, things I could actually control. Over time, I became a combat medic, then an officer. I built a career, built friendships, built a purpose. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father grew colder. Phone calls became rare. Visits became shorter. Every holiday felt like walking into a room where I wasn't wanted. Still, I kept trying. Because no matter how old we get, part of us remains that child waiting for a parent to finally say, "I'm proud of you." The words never came. Years passed. Then my grandfather died. Grandpa Henry was different from my father. Kind, patient, fair. He treated Michael and me equally. When I visited, he asked about my deployments, my patience, my life. He listened, actually listened. After he passed away, I was devastated. The funeral was difficult. But what happened afterward proved even worse. A few months later, my father informed me there would be an estate hearing. Nothing unusual. Families handle inheritances every day. I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, I didn't care much about the money. I attended out of respect for my grandfather. Then I arrived at the courthouse. The atmosphere felt strange immediately. Michael looked smug. My father looked confident. My mother looked nervous. The attorneys exchanged paperwork. The hearing began. One document after another was reviewed. Then came the announcement. Michael would receive nearly everything. The company shares, the investment accounts, the properties, the savings, everything. I received nothing. Not a dollar, not a keepsake, not even my grandfather's old watch. Nothing. For a moment I simply sat there, trying to process what I'd heard. Then my father leaned toward me. A smile spread across his face. The smile of a man finally delivering a punishment he'd waited years to give. And that's when he said it. "Hope you enjoy being homeless, because I made sure you get nothing." The room became silent. I looked at him. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because suddenly something felt very wrong indeed. And judging by the expression forming on the judge's face, I wasn't the only one who sensed it. The courtroom remained quiet after my father's remark. I could feel dozens of eyes moving between us. Some people looked embarrassed for me. Others looked curious. Most seemed to assume they were witnessing a simple inheritance dispute. A bitter daughter. A disappointed father. Nothing unusual. The judge, however, wasn't looking at my father anymore. He was looking directly at me. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with recognition. The kind of expression someone gets when they're trying to remember where they've seen a face before. He glanced down at the paperwork, then back at me. Then down again. The room felt strangely still. Even my father seemed unsettled. "Your Honor," his attorney finally asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said slowly. "Have we met before?" I blinked. "No, sir." His forehead wrinkled. "That's odd." He studied me another moment. Then he shook his head and returned his attention to the documents. The hearing resumed. But something had changed. I could feel it. The judge wasn't paying attention the same way he had before. Every few minutes he'd glance toward me again, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Meanwhile, my father sat confidently beside Michael. Neither of them noticed. Or perhaps they simply didn't care. They believed they had already won. And maybe they would have, if life hadn't taken a very unexpected turn several years earlier. A turn my family knew almost nothing about, because they never asked. Most of my military career was invisible to them. They knew I served. They knew I deployed. That was about it. Whenever I visited home, conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Dad would ask when I planned to leave the army. Michael would talk about the company. Mom would try to keep everyone polite. Then we'd all go home. No one ever asked what I had experienced overseas. No one ever asked what I had seen, or who I had become. Perhaps that's why they never learned about Afghanistan. 5 years earlier, I was serving as a combat medic attached to an army unit operating near Kandahar. It wasn't my first deployment, but it was the hardest. The region was dangerous. Roadside bombs, rocket attacks, constant uncertainty. Every day required focus. The smallest mistake could get someone killed. By then I was a captain, experienced enough to stay calm under pressure, at least most of the time. The incident that changed everything happened on an unusually hot afternoon in July. I remember the heat more than anything. The air felt thick. The dust seemed to cover everything. We had just returned from a patrol when alarms sounded across the compound. At first, nobody understood what was happening. Then the explosion hit. The blast shook the ground beneath us. Windows shattered. Smoke filled the air. People started yelling. Training took over. Everyone moved automatically. Soldiers rushed toward defensive positions. Medics rushed toward the wounded. I ran toward the explosion. Not because I was brave, because that's what medics do. When everyone else runs away from danger, we run toward it. The damaged structure was partially collapsed. Fire spread rapidly through one section. Several soldiers had been trapped inside. The situation was chaotic. People shouted conflicting information. Nobody knew exactly how many were missing. I remember reaching the building entrance. A sergeant grabbed my arm. "Captain, it's too dangerous." I pulled free. "There are still people inside." Then I went in. The smoke was overwhelming. Visibility was terrible. The heat felt like opening an oven door directly into my face. Inside, everything was confusion. Broken concrete, twisted metal, falling debris. I located the first injured soldier near a collapsed wall. He was conscious but unable to walk. I dragged him outside, then went back in, again and again. Each trip became more dangerous. The fire continued spreading. Parts of the structure were becoming unstable. Someone outside shouted that the roof might collapse. They were probably right. But there were still voices inside. I could hear them. One belonged to a young lieutenant, barely 25 years old, pinned beneath debris, terrified. I managed to reach him during my 4th entry. The situation was bad. His leg was trapped. Smoke was thickening. The ceiling groaned above us. For a moment, I honestly thought we might both die there. But somehow we got him free. I don't remember much after that. Only fragments. The weight, the heat, the exhaustion, the sound of people yelling outside when we emerged. Then darkness. I woke up 2 days later. Concussion, smoke inhalation, minor injuries. Nothing life-threatening. The lieutenant survived. So did several others. In total, 6 soldiers were pulled from that building. The Army conducted an investigation. Statements were collected. Reports were written. Then life moved forward. At least for me. The military later awarded me a medal for the rescue. There was a ceremony, a few photographs, some media coverage. The usual things. I never thought much about it afterward. Most veterans don't. You do your job. You move on. Besides, countless service members had done far more heroic things than I ever would. What mattered to me was simple. People came home alive. That was enough. The strange part came months later. A letter arrived. Handwritten. Unexpected. Inside was a message from the father of the young lieutenant I had helped rescue. He thanked me for saving his son, said there were no words large enough to express his gratitude. The letter was deeply personal, heartfelt. I kept it in a drawer. Nothing more. Life continued. Another deployment. Another assignment. Another year. Eventually, I forgot about the letter altogether. And apparently my family never knew it existed. Not that they would have cared. Back in the courtroom, the hearing entered its 2nd hour. The attorneys continued discussing assets, property valuations, account transfers, legal language that bored everyone except the lawyers. I noticed the judge becoming increasingly distracted. At one point, he removed his glasses entirely. He stared at me, not casually, intently. Then he opened a folder. flipped through several pages, stopped. His eyes widened. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. The judge suddenly looked as though he had found something important. Very important. Slowly he raised his head. The courtroom fell silent again. My father shifted in his chair. "What is it?" Michael whispered. Nobody answered. The judge continued staring at me. For several long seconds he said nothing. Then his expression changed completely. Recognition. Absolute recognition. As if a missing piece had finally fallen into place. He leaned forward. "Miss Morgan?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." His voice sounded almost disbelieving. "Your full name is Rachel Ann Morgan." "Yes, sir." He sat back slowly. A look of astonishment crossed his face. Then he whispered words that made my heart skip. Words I never expected to hear in that courtroom. Dear God. The judge stared at me, and suddenly I realized he remembered exactly who I was. Dear God. The judge's voice barely rose above a whisper. Yet somehow everyone in the courtroom heard it. The room fell completely silent. No rustling papers, no whispered conversations, no movement. Just silence. I sat frozen in my chair. The judge stared at me as though he had just seen a ghost. My father looked irritated. Michael looked confused. The attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. "Miss Morgan," he said carefully. "Would you please stand?" I slowly rose to my feet. Every eye in the room followed me. For a moment I wondered if I had somehow done something wrong. The judge continued studying me. Then he asked a question I never expected. "Were you serving near Kandahar 5 years ago?" My stomach tightened. "Yes, sir." A murmur moved through the courtroom. The judge nodded slowly. "And were you the Army captain who entered a burning operations building multiple times after an enemy attack?" The room became even quieter. I could actually hear the air conditioning system humming above us. I hesitated. Not because I was hiding anything. I simply hated talking about it. "Yes, sir." The judge closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they looked emotional. Very emotional. My father shifted uncomfortably. "What does this have to do with anything?" he asked. The judge ignored him. Instead, he continued looking at me. "Captain Rachel Morgan. I hadn't heard anyone call me that in months. Not since leaving active service." The title sounded strange inside a probate courtroom. The judge nodded to himself. Then he turned toward the spectators, toward the attorneys, toward everyone. "I cannot believe this." My father frowned. "Your Honor." The judge finally looked at him. What happened next changed the entire atmosphere of the room. "You really don't know who your daughter is, do you?" The question hit my father like a slap. His face reddened immediately. "What is that supposed to mean?" The judge leaned back in his chair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked directly at me. "I owe this woman more than I can ever repay." The room exploded into whispers. My father looked stunned. Michael looked even worse. I felt my heart begin to pound. Because suddenly I knew exactly what was happening. The letter, the young lieutenant, the father. Oh my God. The judge wasn't just someone who had heard about the rescue. He was the father. The realization hit me all at once. The courtroom seemed to shrink around me. The judge slowly stood. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody dared. My son was serving in Afghanistan 5 years ago. His voice was steady, but emotion lingered beneath every word. He was trapped inside a building after an enemy attack. Several people in the courtroom leaned forward. The judge continued. "The military informed us there had been casualties." His eyes drifted toward the floor. I still remember receiving that phone call. For the first time, he sounded less like a judge and more like a father. A father remembering one of the worst days of his life. My wife and I spent hours believing our son might be dead. The courtroom remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We later learned he survived because a combat medic repeatedly entered a burning structure to rescue trapped soldiers. He looked at me, directly at me. That medic was Captain Rachel Morgan. A collective gasp swept across the room. I heard someone whisper, "Wow." Another person muttered, "No way." My father simply stared. The confident smile he'd worn all morning had vanished completely. The judge wasn't finished. Most people never hear about acts of courage like that. His gaze moved across the room. They happen every day among the men and women who serve this country. Then he looked back at my father. But occasionally one of those stories becomes very personal. His voice softened. "My son came home because of her." Nobody spoke. I felt dozens of eyes fixed on me. The attention made me uncomfortable. It always had. I wished I could disappear. But the judge continued. "Captain Morgan suffered injuries during the rescue." I quietly shook my head. They weren't serious. He smiled sadly. That's exactly what my son said you would say. A few people laughed softly. The tension broke for a moment. Then the judge reached into his briefcase. He opened a worn leather folder. From inside, he removed a folded piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. A copy of the letter. The one he had written years earlier. I keep this in my office. His voice grew quieter. I read it every Veterans Day. My throat tightened. I hadn't expected that. Not at all. The judge unfolded the paper. Then he read a few lines aloud. Not many. Just enough. Enough to understand. Enough to feel the weight behind the words. A father thanking the woman who saved his son. A family expressing gratitude that could never truly be repaid. When he finished, nobody spoke. Several people looked emotional. One elderly woman in the gallery wiped her eyes. Even one of the attorneys looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable that comes from realizing you've misjudged someone. The judge folded the letter carefully. Then he turned toward my father again. What surprises me most, he said, is that this appears to be news to her family. My father swallowed. For the first time all day, he looked unsure of himself. Michael finally spoke. You never told us. I looked at him. You never asked. The words came out gently. Not angry. Not bitter. Simply true. Michael looked away. My mother lowered her head. Tears had begun forming in her eyes. I wasn't sure whether they came from pride or guilt. Perhaps both. The judge slowly returned to his seat. But before sitting down, he said something that nobody in that room would ever forget, including me. He looked directly at my father. His expression was calm, controlled. Yet there was steel beneath it, the kind of steel that comes from conviction. You may not know who your daughter is, Mr. Morgan. The room held its breath. But I do. Silence. Absolute silence. My father had spent decades building a reputation, building authority, building status. Yet in that moment he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not because the judge humiliated him, because the truth had. For years, Dad had viewed me as the disappointing daughter. The daughter who abandoned the family business. The daughter who chose military service over his approval. The daughter who could never measure up to Michael. Now, strangers in the courtroom were looking at me with more respect than my father had shown in 20 years. And for the first time, I think he realized it. The judge glanced back down at the estate documents. His expression changed. The emotional moment was over. Now he was a judge again. Professional. Methodical. Sharp. He picked up one of the files. Flipped through several pages. Then stopped. His eyes narrowed. The room grew quiet once more. A different kind of quiet. Not emotional. Concerned. The judge examined a document. Then another. Then another. Slowly he looked toward my father's attorney. Counselor. The attorney straightened. Yes, Your Honor. The judge tapped the paperwork with one finger. His face had become unreadable. I have a question regarding these asset transfers. My father's expression changed instantly, and for the first time that day, I saw fear. Real fear. The fear appeared for only a second. Most people in the courtroom probably missed it. I didn't. When you've spent years in the military, you learn to notice tiny changes in people. A tightened jaw, a sudden shift in posture, a glance that lasts a fraction too long. Fear has a way of revealing itself, and my father was afraid. The judge held up a document. Counselor, can you explain this transfer? My father's attorney adjusted his glasses. Which transfer, Your Honor? The Riverside property. The attorney accepted the document. His confident expression faded almost immediately. I'll need a moment. The judge nodded. You have one. A strange tension settled over the room. The kind that appears when something unexpected enters the conversation. Something nobody planned for. My father sat perfectly still. Too still. Michael noticed it too. Dad? No response. Dad? My father finally looked at him. It's nothing. But it didn't sound like nothing. The judge continued reviewing paperwork. Several minutes passed. Then he located another document. His expression darkened further. Interesting. Nobody liked the sound of that word. Especially lawyers. The attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, there may be a clerical explanation. Perhaps. The judge picked up another file. Then maybe you can explain this one as well. The attorney accepted it. Read it. Then frowned. I watched him carefully. Whatever he was seeing, he clearly hadn't expected it. That surprised me. Until that moment, I had assumed everyone involved knew exactly what was happening. Apparently they didn't. The judge leaned back. Let's take a brief recess. His gavel struck. People immediately began whispering. Attorneys gathered around tables. Spectators discussed the military story they'd just heard. The atmosphere felt completely different now. The inheritance hearing had transformed into something else. Something bigger. I remained seated. I wasn't interested in gossip. I simply wanted answers. A few moments later, my mother approached. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. Fragile. Rachel. I looked up. "Hi, Mom." Her eyes filled with tears. I didn't know. I already knew what she meant. "The rescue." She nodded. "Why didn't you tell us?" I offered a sad smile. "When would I have told you?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because she knew the answer. There hadn't been a moment. Not one. Over the years, our conversations had become polite exchanges about weather holidays and schedules. Nothing deeper. Nothing real. My mother sat beside me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered something that hurt more than I expected. I should have asked. I nodded. "Yeah." She looked down at her hands. I should have asked a lot of things. Across the room, Michael was arguing quietly with our father. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read body language. Michael looked frustrated. Dad looked defensive. That alone felt unusual. For most of my life, Michael had followed Dad's lead without question. Now something had changed. The recess ended 15 minutes later. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge immediately resumed reviewing documents. No small talk, no delay. Straight to business. Before proceeding, he said, "I have concerns regarding several transactions connected to this estate." The room became silent again. The attorney rose. "We are prepared to address any concerns, Your Honor." "Good." The judge held up a folder. "Because I have many." A few people exchanged nervous glances. The judge began listing dates, property transfers, investment reallocations, changes to ownership records. Most sounded incredibly boring. Until he reached one specific date. A date that made my mother's face go pale. The judge noticed. "So you recognize that date?" My mother hesitated. "Yes." "What is its significance?" She looked toward my father. For a moment I thought she might remain silent, just as she had remained silent so many times before. Then something unexpected happened. She answered. "That was the week my father was hospitalized." The room grew still. The judge nodded. "Your father being Henry Lawson?" "Yes." "My grandfather." The judge continued. "Medical records indicate he was heavily medicated during that period." My father's attorney stood quickly. "Objection." "On what grounds?" The attorney hesitated. The judge waited. No answer came. Finally, the judge continued. "During that same period, multiple estate modifications were executed." The room seemed to shrink around us. I looked at my father. His face had become expressionless, but I could see the tension in his eyes. The judge wasn't accusing anyone yet. He was simply laying out facts, yet those facts sounded increasingly troubling. Then came the moment that changed everything. The judge opened another folder. A thick one. He removed a handwritten document. "What is that?" Michael asked. Nobody answered. The judge examined the paper carefully. Then he spoke. "This appears to be an earlier version of Mr. Lawson's estate plan." My heartbeat quickened. "Earlier version?" The attorney looked confused. "I wasn't aware such a document existed." Apparently, neither were several other people. The judge began reading portions aloud. Not everything. Just enough. Enough to establish a shocking fact. My grandfather's original estate plan had divided assets equally between Michael and me. 50-50. Exactly equally. The courtroom erupted. People whispered openly now. Even the attorneys looked stunned. I sat frozen, unable to process what I had heard. Equal. Grandpa had intended equal. All these years, I had assumed he simply preferred Michael, just like Dad did. Apparently, I had been wrong. Very wrong. My throat tightened. I suddenly remembered countless conversations with Grandpa. The way he'd always treated me fairly. The way he'd never compared me to Michael. The way he'd always listened. Of course. Of course, he hadn't cut me out. He never would have. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. Across the room, Michael looked horrified. "Dad!" My father stared straight ahead. Not moving. Not speaking. Michael's voice shook. "Dad, what is this?" Still no answer. The judge folded the document, then looked directly at my father. "Mr. Morgan." "Nothing." "Mr. Morgan." Slowly, Dad raised his eyes. The judge's voice remained calm, but firm. "Can you explain why your father-in-law's original estate plan differs so dramatically from the final version?" Silence. A long silence. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in my life, William Morgan appeared completely unprepared. The man always had answers, always had explanations, always controlled the room. Not today, the judge continued. Perhaps more importantly, he lifted another document. Can you explain why several transfers appear to benefit only one beneficiary? Michael looked stunned. Beneficiary. The judge turned a page. Your son. The color drained from Michael's face, because suddenly he realized something. This wasn't simply about me being excluded. This wasn't just favoritism. This was something far more serious. If these documents were accurate, my father hadn't merely hurt me. He may have manipulated an entire estate. An estate belonging to a dying man who trusted him. And for the first time, Michael looked at Dad not with admiration, but with doubt. The judge closed the folder. His expression was grave. I'm ordering a full review of these records. The room exploded into murmurs. My father finally spoke. That's ridiculous. The judge's gaze hardened. No, Mr. Morgan. He paused. What's ridiculous is that these questions were never asked sooner. And suddenly I understood something. The inheritance hearing wasn't ending. It was just beginning. For most of my life, my father had been the strongest man in every room. Not physically, not emotionally, but socially, financially, professionally. People listened when William Morgan spoke. Bankers respected him. Business owners sought his advice. Church leaders praised his generosity. Neighbors admired his success. My father had spent decades building a reputation. And now, for the first time, I was watching cracks form in that foundation. The court-ordered review moved quickly, faster than I expected. The judge postponed further estate proceedings pending investigation. Within weeks, accountants began examining records, property transactions, bank statements, estate documents, tax filings, everything. I returned to my normal life. At least I tried to. I was no longer on active duty, having recently transitioned into civilian healthcare work at a veterans medical center outside Columbus. My days were filled with patients, men and women who had served. Many carried visible wounds. Others carried invisible ones. Working with them helped keep me grounded. The courtroom drama felt distant, until the phone calls started. First came my mother, then my attorney, then Michael. Everyone wanted to talk. Everyone suddenly wanted answers. For years, nobody had shown much interest in my life. Now, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. The irony wasn't lost on me. One afternoon, my attorney called. Rachel, I thought you'd want an update. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee. Good news or bad news? A pause. Depends on how you define good. That wasn't encouraging. What did they find? More than expected. I closed my eyes. Part of me already knew. The evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. Several transactions appeared questionable. Some occurred while my grandfather was heavily medicated. Others involved sudden ownership changes. A few signatures were being examined by forensic specialists. The words made my stomach turn. Not because I was surprised. Because I wasn't. Deep down, I think I had known for years that something wasn't right. I simply never wanted to believe my father could go that far. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad. Profoundly sad. Because every new discovery damaged not only my father, it damaged the entire family. A week later, the local newspaper published an article. Nothing dramatic. Just a brief report about an ongoing probate dispute involving a prominent businessman. No accusations. No conclusions. Just facts. Yet that was enough. In small communities, people noticed things. Within days, rumors spread. Questions followed. Business associates became cautious. Clients grew nervous. People started talking. For the first time in decades, my father was no longer controlling the narrative. The truth was beginning to speak for itself. Then Michael showed up at my house. Unannounced. I nearly didn't recognize him. He looked exhausted. Older. Defeated. Nothing like the confident older brother I remembered. When I opened the door, he stood there awkwardly. Can we talk? I hesitated, then nodded. We sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I usually paid bills and sorted mail. Nothing fancy. Nothing impressive. Michael stared at his coffee. For nearly a minute. Finally he spoke. Did you know what? That Grandpa wanted things divided equally. I shook my head. No. His shoulders slumped. I didn't either. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he laughed bitterly. I spent my entire life believing I earned everything. His words carried genuine pain. Not arrogance, pain. I thought Dad trusted me more. I looked at him carefully. The realization was hitting him hard. Because favoritism hurts everyone, including the favorite, especially the favorite. It creates impossible expectations, distorted relationships, false confidence. Michael was finally seeing that. "I never asked for this," he said quietly. "I know. I honestly thought Grandpa changed his mind." "I know." He looked at me. His eyes were red. "You hate me, don't you?" The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. Years of resentment, years of unfair treatment, years of comparisons. Then I shook my head. "No." His expression softened slightly. "I probably would." I smiled sadly. "Maybe when I was younger." We sat in silence. For the first time in our lives, we weren't competing. We weren't arguing. We weren't playing roles assigned by our father. We were simply two people trying to understand what had happened to our family. Before leaving, Michael stopped at the door. "Rachel." "Yeah, I'm sorry." The words were simple, but sincere, and somehow that mattered. A lot. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice sounded fragile. "Would you come by?" I almost said no. Almost. Instead, I drove to the house where I grew up. The same house. The same front porch. The same maple tree in the yard. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow smaller. My mother greeted me at the door. The moment I saw her face, I knew something had changed. She looked exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. We sat in the living room. The room where decades of family history had unfolded. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, arguments, silences, all of it. My mother twisted a tissue in her hands. Then she finally said what she'd been carrying for years. I knew some things weren't right. I remained silent. I didn't know everything. Her voice cracked. But I knew enough. The words hurt. Not because they shocked me. Because they confirmed what I'd always suspected. "You could have said something." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I know." "You could have defended me." "I know." "You could have stopped some of it." She lowered her head. "I know." The room fell silent. For years I had imagined this conversation. Imagined yelling. Imagined anger. Imagined confrontation. Instead, all I felt was sadness. My mother wasn't evil. She wasn't cruel. She was weak. And weakness has consequences, sometimes devastating ones. Before I left, she hugged me. For a long time. Longer than she ever had when I was young. Neither of us said much. There wasn't much left to say. Weeks turned into months. The investigation continued. Evidence accumulated. Questions multiplied. Meanwhile, my father seemed to withdraw from the world. Friends stopped calling as often. Business lunches disappeared. Community invitations slowed. People who once praised him now avoided uncomfortable conversations. Success attracts company. Scandal creates distance. One evening I drove past his office building. The parking lot was nearly empty. The lights were off. For some reason, that image stayed with me. Not because I enjoyed it. Because I didn't. The man who had spent decades chasing status was discovering how fragile status really is. Money can disappear. Reputation can collapse. Power can fade. What remains is character. And character is much harder to build. A few days later, I received another call from my attorney. The review is almost complete. I stared out my apartment window. And a long pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Rachel, I think your father is about to lose far more than this case." After the call ended, I sat alone in the gathering darkness, thinking. Not about inheritance. Not about money. Not about revenge. I thought about family. About choices. About consequences. And somewhere across town, for perhaps the first time in his life, William Morgan was sitting alone with his own. 3 weeks after my attorney told me the investigation was nearly complete, I received a phone call I never expected. It was my father. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. William Morgan. I couldn't remember the last time he'd called me first. Usually communication happened through my mother. Or not at all. The phone rang 4 times before I answered. "Hello." Silence. Then his voice, older than I remembered. Tired. "Rachel." I waited. "I'd like to see you." No apology. No explanation. Just those words. I leaned back in my chair. "Why?" Another pause. "Because there are things I should have said a long time ago." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after 20 years, that statement felt absurd. There were thousands of things he should have said. Thousands. Instead, he had chosen silence. Criticism. Distance. I looked out the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "I understand." His voice sounded defeated. "Not angry. Not defensive. Defeated. Something about that unsettled me. My father had never sounded defeated before, not once. Finally he spoke again. Please. One word. Quiet. Almost fragile. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted to protect myself from whatever came next. But another part of me was tired. Tired of carrying old wounds. Tired of unanswered questions. Tired of wondering why. There's a Veterans Memorial Park near downtown. I knew the place. A peaceful park overlooking the river. Several monuments. Rows of engraved names. A place people visited to remember. To reflect. To grieve. Tomorrow morning. Okay, and that was it. The call ended. I barely slept that night, not because I feared him, because I feared disappointment. Again. The next morning was cool and overcast. The kind of Ohio morning that feels older than the calendar says. I arrived early. Old habits from military life. My father was already there, sitting on a bench near the memorial wall. For a moment I simply watched him. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, spiritually. Like life had finally become heavier than he could carry. When I approached, he stood, awkwardly, almost nervously. I couldn't remember ever seeing him nervous. Thanks for coming. I nodded. Neither of us sat immediately. The silence stretched between us. 20 years of silence. Finally, I sat on the bench. He sat beside me, several feet away, like strangers. Maybe that's what we were. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled nearby trees. A flag moved gently above the memorial. Eventually, my father broke the silence. I saw the investigation report. I waited. They found enough. His voice sounded hollow. The findings had been devastating. Several estate modifications had been ruled improper. Multiple transfers had been reversed. The final legal consequences were still being resolved. But the truth was no longer in doubt. I know. He stared at the memorial wall. I deserve most of what's happened. The admission surprised me. My father had spent his entire life avoiding responsibility, yet here he was, accepting it, at least partially. Still, I wasn't ready to make things easy. Most of it, he nodded slowly. Fair question. For several seconds, he gathered his thoughts. Then he surprised me again. I wasn't angry because you joined the army. I blinked. Of all the things I expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. What? I know that's what you believed. It is what you said. I know. His eyes remained fixed on the memorial. But it wasn't the truth. I folded my arms. Then what was? The answer took a long time to come. When it finally did, it arrived in a voice I'd never heard before. A wounded voice. My brother. I frowned. My Uncle Daniel had died long before I was born. The family rarely spoke about him. Almost never. He enlisted when he was 19. My father swallowed. He was killed overseas. The wind seemed to stop. For a moment, the world felt very quiet. I know. No. He shook his head. You know the facts. His eyes grew distant. I remember the funeral. The pain in his voice was unmistakable. I remember my mother crying every night. He stared toward the river. I remember my father never being the same again. I listened, not interrupting. For the first time in my life, my father was letting me see something beneath the armor. Something real. When you told me you'd enlisted, his voice cracked. All I could think about was Daniel. I sat perfectly still. Years of memories suddenly looked different. The arguments, the anger, the criticism, the constant disapproval. I thought I'd lose you too. The words hit me harder than I expected. My father rubbed his face. For a moment, he looked like an exhausted old man. Not the powerful businessman everyone knew. Just an old man carrying decades of grief. I was terrified. He laughed bitterly. And instead of admitting that, he shook his head. I punished you for it. The truth settled heavily between us. Not an excuse. An explanation. Those are very different things. I understood that. He understood it too. I should have been proud of you. His voice trembled. Instead, every promotion made me angry. I stared at him. Not because I doubted him. Because I believed him. Every word. I kept waiting for you to quit. He laughed softly. You never did. No. A faint smile appeared. No. For the first time that morning, we shared something close to humor. Then his smile vanished. His eyes filled with tears, real tears. I had never seen my father cry. Not once. Not when his parents died. Not when businesses struggled. Not ever. Now tears rolled down his face, and he didn't even try to hide them. I failed you. The words came out broken, raw, honest. I failed you as a father. I felt my own eyes sting. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. Nothing was fixed. Years of damage don't disappear in one conversation. But honesty matters. Truth matters. And this was the first completely honest conversation we'd ever had. He looked at me. I am so sorry, Rachel. Not for the estate. Not for the investigation. Not for getting caught. For me. For us. For everything. The difference mattered. A lot. The wind moved through the trees again. Somewhere nearby a church bell rang. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Just heavy. Human. My father wiped his eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I looked toward the memorial wall. Rows of names. Rows of stories. Rows of people who had sacrificed. Life teaches difficult lessons. Sometimes far too late. Maybe this was one of them. Finally, I looked back at him. The man who had hurt me. The man who had failed me. The man who was still my father. And for the first time in 20 years, I honestly considered forgiving him. A month after my conversation with my father at the Veterans Memorial Park, the estate case finally came to an end. By then, most of the legal questions had been answered. The investigation had confirmed what the judge had suspected. Several changes to my grandfather's estate had been made improperly. Assets that should never have been redirected were restored. The final ruling wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No shocking television-style courtroom scene. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were documents, hearings, corrections, and eventually resolution. My grandfather's wishes were honored.